The mist had barely lifted off the sprawling Norfolk landscape when the harsh reality of the modern era violently collided with the fading remnants of aristocratic privilege at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. Just moments after 8 o'clock in the morning, on what was supposed to be a quiet celebration of his 66th birthday, Thames Valley Police descended upon the residence of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor with clinical, unyielding precision. 6 unmarked police vehicles carved their way through the frost-bitten gravel, depositing a cadre of plainclothes officers who were there not to offer deferential birthday greetings, but to execute an unprecedented arrest on the grounds of the King's beloved private retreat. The stifling atmosphere of supreme humiliation must have been absolutely palpable, as a man who had spent his entire life expecting absolute deference from the world was abruptly subjected to the cold, procedural reading of his rights in the very backyard of the reigning monarch. It is a striking twist of fate that the very institution of British law enforcement, which had for decades operated as a silent, protective barrier between the monarchy and the public, was now the instrument of his spectacular and highly visible downfall. The visual optics of this historic morning, the heir to 1,000 years of unchecked privilege being quietly bundled into an unmarked car on a bleak February morning, will undoubtedly be remembered as the definitive end of an era of aristocratic impunity. One can only begin to imagine the staggering inner monologue of disbelief and terror echoing through the mind of the former prince as the steel trap of his own hubris finally snapped shut around him. Having already endured the profound indignity of being officially stripped of his royal titles by King Charles late last year, and subsequently booted from the sprawling grandeur of Royal Lodge to this humbler cottage, Andrew had clearly remained completely blinded by an archaic sense of untouchability. The sheer arrogance required to sit in a Sandringham cottage, assuming that the storm had safely passed while international law enforcement meticulously unpicked his past, speaks to a psychological detachment from reality that is quite frankly astonishing. As the officers moved through his personal space, sifting through the remains of a deeply compromised life, the suffocating pressure of his sudden mortality, the realization that the invisible shield of the crown had entirely evaporated, must have been entirely paralyzing. For a man who had navigated international elite circles with a grotesque level of entitlement, being reduced to merely a man in his 60s in police custody represents a catastrophic and irreversible psychological collapse. The devastating reality of his current predicament is that he can no longer hide behind his mother's legacy or his brother's good graces, leaving him entirely exposed to the unyielding glare of global justice. Behind the fortified gates of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere is currently one of ruthless pragmatism rather than familial mourning, as King Charles demonstrates exactly what is required to protect a 1,000-year-old institution from the toxic fallout of a rogue relative. The monarch has taken the unprecedented but entirely necessary step of publicly stating his unwavering support for the police, drawing a merciless line in the sand that completely severs his younger brother from any residual royal protection. A well-placed source within palace circles has indicated that His Majesty is deeply, agonizingly aware that this scandal is far from over, and that the long-term survival of the monarchy demands an absolutely brutal surgical excision of Andrew from the family tree. This is not merely a matter of managing bad press, it is an existential crisis handled with the cold calculus of a sovereign who understands that the public will not tolerate the sheltering of a man accused of betraying state secrets, even if he shares the king's blood. The long-term consequence of this definitive severance is clear. The king has chosen the crown over his brother, leaving Andrew to face the immense, crushing weight of the British justice system entirely alone. By unequivocally declaring that the law must take its course, Charles III has effectively sacrificed his own flesh and blood on the altar of public duty, a ruthless but brilliant maneuver designed to insulate the remaining senior royals from the encroaching blast radius. It is in the shadow of this genuinely historic institutional earthquake that we must briefly consider the rather pathetic contrast of what usually passes for a royal crisis in the modern media landscape. While Prince Harry and Meghan Markle continue to tirelessly broadcast their endless, self-serving grievances from across the Atlantic, demanding taxpayer-funded security while simultaneously profiting from their inherited titles. The actual working monarchy is contending with an unprecedented crisis of state security and profound moral decay. One cannot help but look at the Sussex's ceaseless stream of manufactured Californian drama, the perpetual victimhood, the cynical podcast deals, the relentless, tedious whining, and feel a profound sense of exhaustion at their absolute irrelevance to matters of real substance. As Andrew Mountbatten Windsor sits in custody, facing the catastrophic consequences of his alleged geopolitical betrayals, the shallow complaints of a prince who simply did not get his way over a tiara or a cottage feel remarkably absurd. This is the stark reality of the current royal landscape. While some members of the family perform for the cameras to soothe their bruised egos, the serious business of preserving the monarchy against a legitimate, catastrophic threat is playing out in the interrogation rooms of Thames Valley Police. The British public, frankly, has little patience left for overseas tantrums about perceived slights when the actual fabric of the state is being aggressively tested by the spectacular implosion of a man who once walked the halls of power as a senior trade envoy. Let us turn our attention to the precise nature of the charges that have finally brought this gilded existence crashing down, moving past the salacious headlines to the deeply serious accusation of misconduct in public office. The catalyst for this catastrophic dawn raid was, of course, the monumental and unredacted release of the United States Department of Justice documents this past February, a staggering dump of millions of pages that effectively detonated like a subterranean bomb beneath the British establishment. For years, the public had been conditioned to view Andrew's transgressions through the lens of unsavory personal associations and moral bankruptcy, but the unsealed Epstein files have horrifyingly shifted the narrative from a private disgrace to an unprecedented crisis of national security. As the redactions were peeled away by relentless investigative journalists and horrified legal analysts alike, the suffocating atmosphere of impending doom within Buckingham Palace must have been entirely overwhelming as they realized the state itself had been profoundly compromised. The sheer gravity of a former senior royal facing a criminal charge historically reserved for corrupt police officers and compromised politicians represents an irreversible shift in the power dynamic between the crown and the state, guaranteeing a legal reckoning that will leave permanent scars on the institution's history. It is a terrifying testament to a man who fundamentally misunderstood his own invulnerability, blissfully unaware that the meticulously documented ledgers of a convicted criminal would eventually form the absolute foundation of his legal and public ruin. The most damning revelations to emerge from this digital avalanche center on the astonishingly reckless period between 2010 and 2011, a time when the former Duke of York was ostensibly serving as the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment. While parading across the globe on the taxpayer's dime, projecting the illusion of a seasoned statesman negotiating complex economic treaties, Andrew was allegedly utilizing his high-level security clearance to funnel highly classified government trade briefs directly into the hands of Jeffrey Epstein. The details emerging are frankly staggering, outlining how confidential assessments regarding lucrative investment opportunities and sensitive market strategies in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Vietnam were casually forwarded to a disgraced financier whose primary currency was leverage and blackmail. The sheer breathtaking brazenness of taking confidential documents, painstakingly prepared by Her Majesty's government, and sliding them across the table to a man already convicted of soliciting a minor is a betrayal of the state so profound that it defies logical comprehension. The long-term consequences of this astonishing breach of trust are already sending shockwaves through the global diplomatic community, as international allies are forced to quietly reassess the security protocols surrounding British royal envoys and the integrity of the information shared with them. One must imagine the crippling humiliation currently washing over the seasoned diplomats who were forced to facilitate his grand tours, only to realize years later that their painstakingly gathered intelligence was being used as a vulgar entry ticket to Epstein's sordid world of influence. To truly understand the mechanics of this catastrophic betrayal, one must delve into the remarkably fragile psychology of a man who spent his entire life desperately overcompensating for his permanent status as the spare to the heir. driven by a remarkably toxic combination of deep-seated intellectual insecurity and a clawing, desperate need to be perceived as a genuine geopolitical heavyweight. Andrew found the intoxicating allure of Epstein's vast wealth and shadowy network of global power brokers entirely irresistible. Epstein, a master manipulator of human ego, provided the former prince with the grand illusion that he was the smartest man in the room, seamlessly integrating him into a world where billionaires and power brokers seemingly bypass the tedious constraints of international law and democratic oversight. The absolute carelessness required to toss British national security secrets around like cheap party favors speaks to a man so blinded by his own towering hubris that he completely forgot his fundamental duty to the very nation that funded his lavish existence. It is a grimly fascinating psychological study in how the desperate pursuit of relevance and the intoxicating proximity to seemingly limitless, unchecked wealth can entirely rot the moral compass of a man raised within the highest echelons of privilege, while figures like the Duke and Duchess of Sussex continuously cry betrayal over perceived familial slights, leaked wedding details, and endlessly rehashed squabbles over royal housing. Their transatlantic theatrics pale into absolute insignificance when compared to the astonishing reality of a senior royal allegedly bartering genuine state secrets to secure a seat at the table of a convicted sex offender. The reverberations of this scandal have naturally extended far beyond the immediate shock of the morning raid, triggering a terrifying geopolitical fallout and an atmosphere of absolute apoplectic fury within the deepest corridors of Whitehall. There are already terrifying whispers circulating regarding foreign intelligence angles, with security analysts frantically attempting to determine if hostile state actors, particularly in regions like Hong Kong, successfully leveraged Epstein's possession of these sensitive trade documents to outflank British interests. A source within the inner circle has painted a remarkably bleak picture of the current mood among senior civil servants, describing a profound, seething anger from the intelligence officials who had repeatedly and fruitlessly warned against the Duke's completely unchecked access and rogue, undocumented meetings. The realization that the formidable British intelligence apparatus was essentially bypassed by the staggering naivety and supreme arrogance of their own royal envoy has caused a level of institutional embarrassment that will undoubtedly take decades to properly repair. As the former prince stews in a holding cell, entirely stripped of his pomp and circumstance, the lasting consequence of his actions is a permanently fractured trust between the intelligence community and the monarchy, a divide that King Charles is now desperately attempting to bridge. The catastrophic legacy of Andrew's desperate bid for personal power is a deeply compromised nation, forced to frantically assess the damage caused by a man who treated his country's most sensitive secrets as mere currency in his relentless pursuit of status. The swift and brutal political execution delivered by the Prime Minister this week has unequivocally demonstrated that the era of institutional shielding for errant royalty is permanently, irreversibly over. When Sir Keir Starmer stood before the press and delivered the unyielding, clinically precise statement that nobody is above the law, he was not merely offering a political platitude, he was driving a final, fatal stake through the heart of aristocratic immunity. The atmosphere within the corridors of Downing Street must have been electric, with a quiet, calculated resolve, as the government officially washed its hands of a man who had become an untenable radioactive liability. For decades, a deeply ingrained culture of deference had historically mandated that the state apparatus would quietly close ranks to protect the dignity of the crown, often at the expense of absolute justice, shielding those at the very top from the consequences of their darkest indiscretions. Starmer's blunt commentary, however, signals a definitive, cold-blooded severance, forcing the former prince to finally confront the terrifying reality of a justice system that no longer views him through the protective lens of his illustrious lineage. The profound inner shock for a man who spent his life expecting the Prime Minister to act as his ultimate protector must be absolutely paralyzing as he suddenly realizes he is being treated with the exact same merciless scrutiny as any ordinary citizen facing severe criminal charges. The long-term consequences of this political pivot are staggering, permanently redefining the social contract between the British public and the monarchy by proving that even the highest echelons of privilege cannot withstand the crushing weight of public accountability and the unforgiving glare of modern transparency. Behind the heavy gilded doors of the establishment, the coordinated public alignment between the government and Buckingham Palace masks an atmosphere of frantic, suffocating tension as both institutions work overtime to contain the blast radius of this unprecedented scandal. While the official statements project a united front of cooperation and legal transparency, the reality is a desperate, ongoing war room scenario where courtiers and civil servants are meticulously calculating the potential damage of every new, horrifying revelation. The sheer panic gripping the old guard of the palace establishment is palpable, as they are forced to witness the total, systematic dismantling of a senior royal's life by the very state mechanisms they once effortlessly controlled and manipulated. It is a deeply uncomfortable psychological transition for the men in gray suits, who must now ruthlessly abandon a man they previously bowed to, prioritizing the absolute survival of King Charles's reign over any lingering, outdated loyalties to his profoundly disgraced brother. The inner turmoil of these career courtiers, torn between the ingrained, lifelong habit of royal protection and the terrifying realization that covering for a man implicated in state betrayal would be institutional suicide, creates an environment of paranoid, hyper-vigilant damage control. Ultimately, this ruthless, necessary pruning guarantees the survival of the crown in a modern, deeply cynical age, but it leaves a permanently fractured trust between the remnants of the old royal order and the cold, unyielding reality of contemporary British governance, forever altering how the palace interacts with the law. Within the steely, highly disciplined confines of Kensington Palace, the Prince and Princess of Wales are navigating this historical wreckage with a level of strategic, necessary distancing that borders on the absolute surgical. A well-meaning staff member has quietly noted that the mood surrounding William and Catherine is one of absolute, unyielding focus on their public duties, entirely cutting off the oxygen to both the toxic transatlantic whining of the Sussexes and the devastating criminal reality of the York scandals alike. Prince William, staring down the barrel of his future kingship, must be experiencing an inner monologue of profound, simmering fury at his uncle's catastrophic recklessness, recognizing that this entirely self-inflicted wound deeply threatens the inheritance he has spent his entire life painstakingly preparing for. Catherine, as ever the stabilizing bedrock of the modern institution, presents an impenetrable facade of stoic resilience, projecting the exact kind of flawless, dutiful dignity the public desperately craves in moments of severe institutional chaos. It is a stark, almost laughable contrast to the perpetual self-indulgent noise emanating from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, whose endless, lucrative complaints about perceived family slights look increasingly pathetic when placed alongside the very real existential threat currently facing the monarchy. The Prince and Princess of Wales have rightly concluded that the only viable path forward is a total, uncompromising dedication to the working crown, entirely severing themselves from the moral decay of the past and the tedious, superficial grievances of the exiled Montecito contingent, ensuring their own legacy remains untainted. The most immediate and terrifying reality now crashing down upon the former Duke is not merely the prospect of imprisonment, but the absolute, looming certainty of total financial annihilation as King Charles definitively severs the final remaining lifelines of his existence. Stripped of the protective umbrella of the sovereign grant and officially denied access to the vast, secretive wealth of the duchy purse, Andrew is now staring over a catastrophic financial cliff edge with absolutely no parachute in sight, a harsh awakening for a man completely unaccustomed to the word no. The inner terror of a man who has lived a life of completely unearned astronomical luxury, funding helicopters, sprawling estates, and endless, shadowy legal settlements with other people's money, must be entirely suffocating as he realizes he must now personally foot the bill for the most expensive criminal defense in modern British history. We must understand the profound systemic humiliation of this moment. The former prince is now facing ruinous, insurmountable legal fees that will undoubtedly force the rapid, embarrassing liquidation of whatever meager, heavily mortgaged assets he still legally possesses. King Charles's brutal but brilliant financial excommunication ensures that not a single penny of taxpayer money or royal revenue will be squandered on defending the indefensible, a move that permanently and publicly neuters his brother's ability to fight a protracted, high-priced legal war of attrition. The long-term consequence of this financial starvation is absolute, irreversible ruin, ensuring that even if Andrew Mountbatten Windsor somehow evades the darkest corners of the penal system, he will spend the remainder of his life in genuine, ignominious obscurity, entirely bankrupted by his own towering hubris and severed completely from the royal vault. As if the betrayal of sovereign state secrets were not enough to permanently shatter whatever remnants of public goodwill still clung to the disgraced former duke, the narrative takes a profoundly darker, infinitely more abhorrent turn as we look beyond the geopolitical and directly into the deeply personal. The fresh, urgent appeals issued by Surrey police this week regarding allegations of human trafficking and severe sexual assaults in the deeply affluent, heavily fortified enclave of Virginia Water between 1994 and 1996, have effectively ripped the velvet curtain away from a decade historically remembered for its shallow, hedonistic, aristocratic excess. We are no longer simply discussing the breathtaking arrogance of a rogue trade envoy casually exchanging confidential dossiers over brandy. We are now being forced to stare directly into the terrifying abyss of a systemic, highly organized predatory ring allegedly operating within the very heart of the British home counties. The psychological toll of this specific revelation on the former prince must be entirely consuming, as the creeping, icy dread of his long-buried, supposedly untouchable past suddenly resurrects itself in the unforgiving light of modern criminal investigations. For years, the narrative surrounding the 1990s royal social scene was carefully managed. Painted as a harmless era of playboy princes and glamorous socialites, completely obscuring the deeply sinister reality that is now actively being unpicked by seasoned detectives begging for public assistance. The stifling atmosphere of impending, irreversible doom that must currently be suffocating Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is the direct consequence of a man who genuinely believed that the staggering wealth and absolute privacy of his elite Surrey circles permanently insulated him from the mundane constraints of human morality. The long-term consequence of these specific, horrifying historical inquiries is the absolute retroactive destruction of an entire era of royal history, permanently replacing the carefully curated myth of harmless aristocratic frivolity with a grotesque, undeniable legacy of exploitation and unchecked predatory privilege. To truly comprehend the sheer, terrifying scale of this moral vacuum, one must delve into the deeply unsettling new claims that heavily implicate Ghislaine Maxwell and the wider, incredibly insulated inner circle of depravity that operated with absolute impunity during that era. The horrifying allegations now surfacing from the unredacted files, specifically the sickening claims of a minor being tortured with electric shocks while the aristocratic elite merely watched, represent a level of sociopathic detachment from human suffering that completely defies conventional understanding. We are forced to examine the terrifying psychology of an ultra-exclusive clique that existed entirely within a private, impenetrable bubble of unfathomable privilege, where the traditional boundaries of law, empathy, and fundamental human decency were treated as utterly irrelevant inconveniences. Within the gilded, heavily guarded walls of these vast country estates, an intoxicating cocktail of extreme wealth, aristocratic entitlement, and the deeply malignant influence of Jeffrey Epstein cultivated an atmosphere where the exploitation of the vulnerable was not merely tolerated, but allegedly commodified as private entertainment. The inner monologue of those involved, blinded by the absolute certainty that their titles and bank accounts rendered them completely untouchable, must have been one of supreme, sickening arrogance, entirely devoid of the paralyzing fear of consequence they are all undoubtedly experiencing today. The long-term, irreversible consequence of these abhorrent revelations is the total, permanent eradication of the traditional aristocratic mystique. The British public will never again look upon these glittering social circles with anything but profound, absolute revulsion, recognizing that behind the closed doors of their sprawling mansions, they allegedly harbored the most unspeakable, nightmarish cruelties imaginable. Ultimately, as we stand back and survey the smoking, catastrophic wreckage of this historic morning, the only absolute certainty is the total, irreversible ruin of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a man entirely destroyed by the colossal weight of his own unfettered hubris. The permanent stain on his legacy is completely indelible. He will not be remembered as a decorated naval officer or a senior royal, but as a cautionary tale of spectacular moral decay, a man who allegedly traded sovereign secrets for proximity to a convicted predator and participated in an era of unimaginable exploitation. His inner monologue, as he sits in custody entirely stripped of his titles, his homes, and his institutional shielding, must be one of absolute crushing despair, as he finally realizes that the formidable protective machinery of the crown has been permanently turned against him. King Charles has demonstrated a steely, necessary ruthlessness, recognizing that the long-term survival of the thousand-year-old monarchy absolutely demands the merciless surgical excision of his brother, sacrificing him to the justice system to ensure the institution itself does not perish in the flames of his scandal. As we prepare for the bitter, astronomically expensive, and deeply humiliating legal battles that lie ahead, the British public must brace themselves for even darker revelations, knowing that the final defining chapter of this spectacular fall from grace is only just beginning. The crown will survive, as it always does, through necessary, brutal adaptation, but the man who was once second in line to the throne is now facing a future defined entirely by the cold, unforgiving reality of a prison cell or utter, penniless disgrace.